Morning, everyone. Great to see you all. I, too, enjoyed the Madeleines as well, by the way, Erica, over the break. And I've been bowled over by how many people there are here, actually, at the summit. It's a real source of optimism. And actually, today, I'm going to break the habit of a lifetime and be optimistic about levelling up. I think there's actually a lot to be optimistic about. And the timing of this thing is great, right? Because it's pretty much to the day 2 years since the Levelling Up white paper was issued by government, so we can stock take on progress. But also, I think, look forward to what might need to be done next with, of course, a general election looming. Now, back at the start of this Parliament, as you all know, Levelling Up was seen as the signature initiative of the government. It'll remain that after the next election, whoever the next government is. I mean, these days, the imperative is put on national growth, and that makes sense, of course, given how anemic it has been. But my very strongly held view is that that national growth objective is best achieved, can only be achieved, in fact, from the bottom up. That is to say, through a sequence of supercharged regional growth strategies. It's easy to be negative, even fatalistic, about national growth prospects right now, not least given experience over the last 15 years or so. I see some of that fatalism seeping into the debate about levelling up as well. Just this week, it's only Wednesday, but already this week, there's been 2 pieces in the FT about levelling up. The first of which was an editorial arguing that nothing had been achieved over the past 5 years, and then an opinion piece arguing that nothing could ever be achieved on levelling up. And that's nonsense. That's defeatist nonsense, for reasons I will elaborate on. Like, if you get outside the M25, as I would encourage all FT journalists to do, what you find is real optimism, real energy. You've heard some this morning, you'll hear some more over the course of today. Huge amounts of latent energy that can be unlocked if we play our policy cards right. How do I cheer myself up these days? Let me tell you. I get as far as possible away from Westminster, right? I get on a train, if they're running, and I travel around the regions and nations of the UK. And what I find there is brilliant leadership, dynamism, business, governmental, and community-wise. All of that latent energy ripe to be unlocked in a local come national strategy. So I thought in my few words what I might do is say a little bit about where we are and what's been done so far, then a few words about where we might go next to tee up the fantastic panel I know is planned. So first, the starting point. You all know this, but we began this Parliament in the UK with the largest spatial differences of any Western economy, and indeed wider differences than any time in the past century. And we'll finish this parliamentary term in exactly the same relegation slot. Indeed, if anything, those differences have widened over the period, courtesy of both COVID and of cost of living crisis, which we all know hit hardest the poorest people in the poorest places. Those disparities are very broadly based, some economic, pay and productivity, some social, health and well-being, some environmental, carbon emissions and biodiversity. And these factors, the economic, the social, the environmental, often interact and amplify in negative ways, a negative feedback loop in the poorest places, just as there's a positive feedback loop in the richest places. Pay and health would be a case in point of that gloom loop in the UK's least well-performing places. I recently was up in Liverpool with Stephen, actually. I'm up there again on Saturdays, it turns out. And you can travel a mere 5 miles south to north in Liverpool and lose 15 years of life expectancy. Horrific, right? And while that's extreme, it's by no means unusual across many of our cities. And the essence of levelling up for me is to put those negative feedback loops into reverse. Truth be told, 2 years on from the Levelling Up white paper, there are precious few signs so far of that loop being put into reverse. In other words, the lived experience of the greater number of local people in the poorest parts of the UK is not better, and in most cases, sadly, is worse than it was back in 2019. Now, nonetheless, despite all that, I think it would be wrong to say this evidence suggests somehow that the Levelling Up agenda has drawn a blank. That was the first FT article. Much less that it is a fruitless task. That was the second FT article. And let me set out what I think are some of the brighter spots on the horizon, and then a word or two about what's still to do, which is plainly and self-evidently still a lot. First thing to say is at one level it's unsurprising that we haven't seen people's lived experience much shift. Those spatial differences are deeply entrenched, built up over many decades. It was always going to take a long time to unravel those. That's why the Levelling Up white paper set 12 missions for the medium term to be hit by 2030. That's why it put in place a reporting framework on progress towards those missions, and that's why it put in place a Levelling Up Advisory Council to constructively challenge government on meeting those missions, which, as Erica mentioned, I have the honour to chair. Now, one of those missions was around devolution. In other words, a target that every region of England, if it wished, would have London-style Devo powers by 2030. Truth be told, 2 years ago, that was seen as being a pretty punchy mission, pretty ambitious mission. Lots of my colleagues said, there's no chance, Andy, that one will be hit. But the truth is, I would say we are, if anything, ahead of schedule in hitting that target, around a dozen new Devo deals having been done. And just as importantly, we've seen a deepening of existing deals, starting with the Trailblazers for Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. We now see that trailblazing pack being joined by Liverpool, by West and South Yorkshire, and by the North East. And if completed, that will leave around 2/3 of the English population covered by a Devo deal, and around 90% in the North. A foundational layer, I would argue, for making good on the other missions. One of the key elements of those Trailblazer deals is the move towards a single financial settlement for devolved areas. In other words, a consolidation of that more than 100 pots of central government financing that local areas currently are allocated or have to bid for. That is a huge step forward. Those pots were a nightmare, both for central government administering them, and in particular for resource and cash-strapped local authorities. That shift couldn't come soon enough. What's sometimes called the Hunger Games for central government are going to come to a close, and not before time, pretty soon. There's also been, I think, a degree of welcome progress when it comes to business activity, or clusters, as they're sometimes called. We've seen the introduction of 12 free ports and 12 investment zones, recognizing crucially sectoral specialization as a route to those higher paid, higher skilled jobs we hear much about as the Holy Grail from our politicians. I think the international experience here is salutary. It suggests that clusters, megacities, and in time mega regions are the single most effective route to those higher skilled, higher paid jobs, the secret sauce, if you like, of regeneration. I mentioned I was in Sheffield last week. They were the first, South Yorkshire, the first investment zone. The centrepiece of that is the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, just outside Sheffield in Rotherham. And that is the bridgehead to investment in housing, in transport, in skills, and in green spaces, so that local people right across the South Yorkshire region spot the difference in their lived experience. I see the self-same dynamic playing out in West Yorkshire, in Liverpool, in the East Midlands, in the North East and elsewhere, all of whom I visited recently. Now, of course, all of those ambitious plans cannot and will not run on fresh air. They require financing, and the lion's share of that financing plainly will not come from government, even if the new government tweaks its fiscal rules, which it surely should. It will instead come from the private sector, and here too we have seen early stage steps to unlock more of the deep well of patient capital, pension fund capital, that at present invests far too little in UK businesses and far too little in places across the four corners of the UK. The Edinburgh reforms, the Mansion House Compact, were a vehicle, the first step in unlocking more of those monies and having them distributed outside of the Golden Triangle. So too, I should say, are university-led VC initiatives such as Northern Gritstone and more recently the Midlands Innovation Engine. They too are helping scale those startups and spin-outs, working alongside commercial banks and working alongside the British Business Bank and the UK Infrastructure Bank. And last, but by no means least, the Harrington Review for getting more foreign as well as domestic monies into UK places. Those are all, I think, useful enabling steps. They are necessary, but not sufficient conditions for levelling up. So what more might be done, perhaps by a new government, post the next election? Let me mention, to conclude, 4 from potentially much longer list of things that can and I think should be done to give the giddy up to levelling up, to unlock that potential. Firstly, despite good progress, we plainly need to be, I would say, even more energetic and ambitious about our approach to Devo, not just of spending plans, but taxation plans as well. We are still, I would argue, in the land of incrementalism when it comes to Devo. Old Whitehall centralising habits die hard and very slowly, and that we are seeing. What I'd like to see is a complete reversal of the power presumption. In other words, we say to local leaders, what powers do you need to unlock the potential in your place? And Whitehall then says yes, unless there are overwhelming reasons not so to do, breaking free of that fixed incremental menu that is currently standard fare when doing Devo deals. Secondly, we plainly need a total rethink and reform of the financing of local government. It shouldn't have taken councils going bust to give that momentum, but as they are, we absolutely should. Part of that is very straightforward, implementing the fair funding formula agreed several years back, but actually I'd go much further than that, to a total rethink of the method of local government financing, weighing importantly both economic and social and environmental factors, as we argued in the joint work, RSA and Core Cities UK, Stephen is speaking next, when we published our report last year. And let me also give a shout out to the fantastic work that Greg has done through the 3CI initiative with the report announced yesterday, which very much is of a piece in bringing together the economic, the social and environmental, the public and the private financing to achieve a better settlement. Third, housing. We have, for 2 generations now, built half the number of houses we need in this country. And there's a number of reasons why that's the case, including our absolutely hopeless and regressive approach to the taxation of housing, and our equally hopeless approach to planning. There's endless talk about reforming planning and almost no talk about reforming housing taxation. Both will be needed. But a decent down payment that could be done relatively rapidly is if local places could make much more productive use of the land they already own. Public land owned either by central government or by local government. Putting that to use in a way we see already happening by Network Rail and Transport for London here in London. That's a much better long-term bet for the long-term financing of local authorities than being forced to flog it off, as government is encouraging them to do right now. The clock says 0 seconds left. I'll go with 1 more minute, shall I? Private capital. Listen, progress is being made, but far too slowly. I suspect a much more muscular and directive approach to that is needed. Just look at the sedate progress by the local government pension schemes in consolidating and directing their monies locally over the past few years. More is needed with greater energy, both for those pots and indeed for the private pots that the Mansion House Initiative has put in place. Working in partnership with the BBB and the UKIB and commercial banks. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves' National Wealth Fund might be one vehicle for the bringing together of those pots in a more consolidated directive fashion. Let me wrap up in my 0 seconds. On a medium-term view, the FT are wrong. And I say that as someone who writes occasionally for the FT. I am strangely optimistic about UK. I'm very optimistic about UK growth. And the reason I'm optimistic is because I know how much latent energy there is out in the UK's regions and nations. The best national growth strategy is a bottom-up, levelling up growth strategy. National and local should and could come together as one, as part of the renewal we know we sorely need. Now is the time for that, and this summit is one mechanism for making it happen. That's why I'm optimistic. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to hearing what the panel after me has to say. Thanks, everyone.